Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs.
Right.
All right.
You just stop. Normally you carry on.
I know. I just wanted to see what you would do.
I was like, there's nothing to say to that.
All right. So we decided last week that we were going to talk about mechanics. That is
Yes.
different kinds of mechanics, and actually kick around some ideas and look at some of the more popular general types of dice mechanics, and maybe try to come up with some innovations, or heaven forbid, something different. I guess we could extend it even further than a dice mechanic by saying resolution mechanics, because there are a
Yeah,
small handful of games that don't use dice. I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not a dice goblin, but it does still seem like dice should be anyway. Whatever. That's what we're going to talk about. Just core mechanics, core resolution mechanics today,
Yeah.
primarily by dice.
And if we could fit it in one episode, this could. If this starts overrunning, I think we'll just have to call it and finish it off later in the week.
We're going to be focused. We're going to go no more than 40 minutes.
There are so
I
many
know.
different. As I keep writing my list, I keep thinking of other things.
Yeah.
Of how
But
dice work, because there's really obvious ones, but then there are other ones that I've seen, and it's like, I want to mention some of these.
Yeah.
Some of these might just be a case that we mention it and then that was it. We mentioned it. That's a thing. You don't have to talk about it because it's a thing.
Listeners, the way the genesis of this conversation came from some off-screen conversations between the two of us about. I've been thinking about trying to come up with and think about an original system. Not like I'm not hell bent on creating an original system. I'm more curious about the possibility of creating a new system, and for various reasons. And so it's been a mental exercise, a bike ride thought of late.
We have talked about these reasons separately, but they're not for podcast.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay, so dice mechanics.
Yes.
Let's try. I'd like to approach this maybe categorically, instead of at the granular level, like this game's mechanic and that game's mechanic. I read.
No, I've split it into different kinds of how you can do it.
Yeah.
And the only place I've even mentioned a system is because that's the system that does the thing. Because then I can use it as a reference.
Yeah, no, as an example.
Yeah.
Well, okay. You've got a bunch of notes. I got a bunch of stuff rattling around in my head from these articles that I've read and thinking that I've done. What have you got? What is the most in Chris language, bog standard, the simplest, most obvious dice mechanic out there? Or do you want to start? How do you want to start?
The very, very simplest one is roll in one dice. You roll one dice and you add something. Now that's very, very basic, and there's a very simple reason why it's super, super basic. You have one dice, so there's no bell curve.
Nope.
Bell curves are nice.
Yeah.
On the plus point, the thing about rolling one dice is you have very, very clear probabilities. If you
have an equal probability. If the die, if you have a D10 or a D20 and the thing is built correctly, you have an equal probability of rolling any number on it.
Yeah. Which makes the maths super straightforward.
Yes.
Okay, super, super straightforward to work out the maths. But it also then does have that, you have to be very careful about how you do these systems. And I think a lot of the time people get mixed up with actually not realizing that the dice is doing more work than their character. Okay, so if you think of something like, the obvious one is D&D. So, I have +5 strength. That's massive. That's 25% of the dice thing. And if your target is, 15, you've got a 50-50 chance to do it. But that actually, if you then think about it that way, your character at +5 is incredibly strong and still only succeeds at a difficulty 15 of 50-50. That's not great. And then the difference between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 is tiny.
I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this very example. And technically, if you had a bonus to a check of +5, you would succeed 55% of the time, because only if you rolled a 9 or below, 45% of the chances of the on the roll would you fail. Um, but I thought about this like, okay, and remind me because I avoid 5e, and I think the difficulty ranges have been about the same for the last few editions. But like, what's considered like an average difficulty? Is it
Yeah,
10?
I feel like it's 15. I think 10 is generally considered to be quite easy.
Okay.
But even then, this is the
Well,
thing
think
with
about
D and
the
D.
okay. Let's
You're
just
still
get
going to fail it. A difficulty of 10 is considered to be relatively easy.
yep.
Unless your character is very high level, you will still fail
Well,
that a reasonable
if
chunk of
you
the
are
time.
average, okay, if you're an average character, okay, let's say you're using a stat. Let's you doing a skill check. Average character, which means you don't have a stat bonus.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
stat of 11, you're average. You have your proficiency bonus of a whopping plus, is it plus 2 at first level?
2 at default.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you have plus 2. So you are an average character who is skilled in whatever,
Something. Yeah.
whatever, who cares? Religion. You're trying to identify whatever. And you roll. And it's a difficulty 10.
Yeah, you probably fail.
It's a difficulty 10. You have a 35% chance of failing.
Yeah.
If it's
Which
a
is a lot.
difficulty 15, you have a 60% chance of failing. And so I thought about that. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, that
Now, I mean,
sucks.
the thing with that is that that's a very easy lever to push. You can change the difficulty ratings or you can change the stat bonuses. Um, but I think the people become used to these numbers, and then I think when you play another system and you go back to playing one of those kind of systems, you suddenly go, "Oh wow, you fail a lot in D&D."
Yeah.
You know, like in combat, where you miss a lot. This is
Yep.
why in D&D you end up with people massively optimizing the system. Now, that's
Yep.
not the only system. I remember playing the uni system, which is what I played when I played Buffy, where it was a D10, and actually in that the bonuses were much bigger. So the bonus there, your bonuses were like sort of going from the lows almost up to 10. So the D10 wasn't doing as much of the work as your
Okay.
character.
Yeah,
So
Cyberpunk
whereas
2020 was similar in that respect that you added your stat, your skill, and a die 10, and you were
yeah,
trying to meet or beat a number, and stats and skills for like regular human, would go up to about, if I remember correctly, about 10. So potentially, and 10's exploded, if I remember correctly. It's been ages since I played CP 2020. But yeah, it has, that's these kinds of systems, they offer an advantage in that they are very simple. And the
yeah,
amount of math you have to do at the table is minimal. You're adding two numbers, two whole
right,
numbers, and that's it. And then
easy.
comparing it against a fixed number.
Yeah,
That does make life easier, but
yeah.
you're right. It introduces some some strange
I
mathematical
I
outcomes.
mean, essentially, because you've got this flat, you know, you don't have a curve. You have this flat
Right.
probability. It's very easy to work out the maths in it. You can very easily work out what you're going to get from a bonus. You know, a +1 or +2. Well, that's going to give you that's an extra, 5 or 10% on your roll. It's really straightforward.
Yep.
But with straightforward to me is it's a bit vanilla. It's a bit boring. It does get out of the way. I'll give you that. Gets
Yes, it
out of the
does.
way, lets you play the system, and if that's important, then great. But yeah,
Now,
not
there
my
could be
favorite.
other things. No, notice we're not at all talking about any other variables that a GM or a player could dump in there. I mean, obviously, the easiest thing is in olden days with D&D, you have lots of fixed modifiers, and in Pathfinder, you have modifier porn.
More
Um,
fix modifier.
but aside, and then some other games offer, some things, again, we've said that advantage or inspiration for advantage is not a meta currency. It's just a status. You can use one thing. There are ways to goose the probability in your favor with those kinds of systems. We're
Yeah.
not addressing that.
No, because
Yeah,
I think we'll leave meta currencies for another day, and also
yeah,
modifiers. There's lots of different ways of doing.
yeah,
Well, actually, modifiers thing like that is going to be you're adding or subtracting a set number.
yeah, yeah.
But
Because
let's stick on it.
you're just rolling one die.
Yeah,
Now here's another thing though. You mentioned the bell curve, which is it's I think it's the closest other resolution mechanic to rolling a single die. Instead, you're rolling a cluster of dice and you're adding the numbers together, which
Yeah.
creates more of a bell curve. You are less likely to get more extreme results. You're more likely to get a lump in the middle. Like Traveler, classic Traveler and current Mongoose Traveler second edition, you roll 2d6 and you add modifiers and you're trying to meet or beat a number.
Yeah.
Um,
It's funny. That was literally my number 2. It wasn't the one I was going to go to. Never did the one I had on my list. Yeah, there's so many systems do that. 2d6, 3d6. The new Marvel system uses 3d6.
the Age system from
Age
Green
uses
Ronin uses
3d6.
3d6.
Now, Age is a good example of a system which has a tweak on that,
Yeah.
and one reason why 3d6 does something else. 2d10, that Unity system that occasionally we mentioned, that was 2d10. Now, one thing I'll say about this, you got two things. One thing is because of the bell curve, you'll tend to hit much more the middle.
Yeah.
And there's good and bad things about it. The bad side is it's very unlikely to hit the outside, so you're much more consistent with the dice. That can be good and bad. On the downside, if you need to hit a really big number, you're way less likely to.
Yep.
If you're wanting the bad guys to hit a low number, they're less likely to. And on something like, so you get certain systems. So Apocalypse World is a good example of this. Because you're only ever rolling 2d6 and adding very small modifiers.
Correct.
You literally are either adding like -1, 0, 1, 2. Now, the minute you start getting up to adding 3 or 4, the system just it breaks straight away because you've got such a small range of numbers there.
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful on the maths for this. So
yeah,
like
your modifiers overwhelm the fact that you're only rolling those. Not only you're rolling few dice, but they're only 6-siders.
Yeah.
So it's not
So
you're not going to
the
get
whole
much
point of
range
like your apocalypse, Powered by the Apocalypse stuff is that, you got usually 6 or less is a fail. 7, 8, 9 is a partial success. 10 is a really good success. Now that means 7 is average on 2d6. So with no modifier, you got more than half the chance of getting some kind of success, which is fair enough. But then if you're +1, that suddenly jumps up a lot.
Yeah.
By the time you're on +4, now a good chunk of the time you're actually hitting the 10s.
Yeah.
So your modifiers that means your characters can only have a modifier of -1 to be bad at something, 0, 1, 2, 3. Because beyond that range, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And this is the problem I had with like the Marvel one, the new one, where it was 3d6. The minute you went above sort of +6, +7 into +8, and they were going up to sort of +15, and you're like, your dice only goes between 3 and 18, right?
Yeah.
But their dice didn't even do that because one of their dice doesn't count as a 1. So you had this really narrow dice pool, and their modifiers were beyond the range of the dice. You have to be very, very careful when you're doing the maths for rolling sort of 2d6 or 2d10 or 3d6, because you do move closer into it. So your modifiers have to be much smaller.
Yeah.
Which then means your characters end up being a bit samey.
Well, something pointing back to say just D20. Okay. And we'll just use that as the simple example. And, like I said, Cyberpunk 2020 is a D10 plus some static numbers. I'd say a disadvantage to D20 is that you are exactly as likely to critically succeed, whatever that means in your system. Typically the 20 is automatic success or automatically fail.
Yeah.
You are equally likely to do that. And let's face it, in life, now, of course, in life, you are more likely to have like kind of more blah results, forgettable results than extremely good or extremely bad. Chances are that New Year's Eve party is going to be okay. It's not going to be this massive rager. It's not going to be a total nightmare. It's probably more likely to be that. But, and so one of the problems, and especially if you use a smaller die, like Cyberpunk, if you're only using one die and the die has fewer faces on it, now you have a 20% chance of something extremely good or extremely bad happening. You have a 10% chance, split 5 and 5 with the D20. And this is where our connection between system and story and setting bubbles to the surface for the first time, because if you want more, like, if you want to see more dramatic results, positive, negative, whatever, in your game, then a dice mechanic that is more likely to render those more often should be more to your liking. You should
Yeah.
probably shy away from a bell curve, or if you do have the bell, you do use a bell curve, then those more extreme, like rolling snake eyes or two sixes on a 2d6 or 3d6 or something like that, those kinds of like extreme ones ought to really produce something big because they are
But
going to be really rare.
what I like about rolling multiple dice is then there starts becoming different things you can do. So like something like Unity has rules like if the two numbers are showing the same thing, it means something. And it doesn't have to be good or bad, but it gives you the option in the system to go just a double does something.
Yeah.
The age system does the same. If two of the dice are showing the same number, then this other dice does something.
Yeah, in
Or
Age,
you
if
have
you're
what
not familiar with it, you roll 3d6 and one of them needs to be identifiably different than the other two. And if you
yeah.
roll doubles on any of them, then that third die, which is called the stunt die, based on the number it rolls, you have that many points to spend on a menu to do stuff.
Yeah. Now that's more random than some of the other things we will
It
talk about
is.
later, but at least it is, it is something different.
Yeah.
It is because you have these extra axes of things
Yeah.
because it isn't just the dice that is your success and fail isn't success or fail. You can have ways, or this is my good, the minute you're on multiple dice, you have extra levers to pull because you can now have multiple axes of stuff.
Yeah, and although
Um,
multiple dice does not mean it is a dice pool system, because
no,
if you are, if like I, Age and Traveler are not dice pool systems,
no,
even though you're rolling multiple dice, because those multiple dice are being added, and even though Age gives you that texture of the stunt die, you're still just adding. You are rolling dice in order to gain one number, and
yeah,
then you're going to do one thing with that one number, and that's going to determine success or failure. Now, if there are other things around it that allow for you to account for degree of success or failure, that's a different issue.
yeah,
But
yeah.
those are not dice. Just because you're rolling multiple dice doesn't mean it's a dice pool.
No, we're still on a thing here very much. You have to have a target number and you're
Yep.
rolling the dice and you're adding, or you might be rolling and rolling under, but you're rolling those dice, you're adding them together and you're aiming for a certain thing. So any kind of degree of success or failure is still by how much did you beat the target number.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
sticking on
like
a similar,
Mongoose Traveler Second Edition with the 2d6, they built in this thing called effect, which depending on like if you are successful, depending on how much higher you roll than the target number, um, you can you can use that. Like let's say you had a target number of 8 and you got a total of a 12. Depending
yeah,
on the circumstances, that 4 point differential you could put to use in some like the easiest way is put to use in combat for additional damage. So there are ways to do things with and account for degree of success, even with these simple just meter beat a number
yeah.
systems.
While we're still on like not proper die, this is the one that bugs me. That is not wrong with it. There's some people refer to this as a dice ball, and they're wrong. The things like the way you roll like loads of dice and you add loads together. So I'm thinking of the old West End game Star Wars things
Yeah.
where most of your time your stat is probably 3. So your stat was your dice.
Yeah.
So we're not here now. You're still trying to be a target, but all these other ones, you're rolling. Everyone rolls the same thing, and then you add or subtract based on your stats. Everything we've mentioned so far is basically working
Yeah.
like this. Now, in West End
And that
Game
your
Star
stats
Wars,
are whole numbers.
yeah, in
Yeah.
West End Game Star Wars, your stat was a dice code. So
Yep.
your stat might be 5d6 plus 1 or
Yep.
3d6 plus 2. And the minute you got to plus 3, you went up to the next dice. I think that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those were called pips. So you
Yeah.
were either at X many dice plus 1 plus 2 and then you would step up to the next one. And your skills were nested under your
Yeah.
abilities or your stats so that your skill would start at the stat level. So like if you I forget what the stat that governed being a pilot was, but
It's
if
like
you had
technical or something.
I don't know, but let's say you had your stat was 4D, that'd be 4d6.
Yeah.
And your piloting then could be like 4d6 plus 1 or 5d6 or whatever. And you would just roll that many dice, you add them together, and you were trying to meet or beat a target number. Yeah, but there was degree of success in that
There was, but that was because
for
they were kind of
damage.
banking on the fact that when you were decent at something, you would be rolling more dice. So,
Yeah.
if you were decent at something, you would be rolling 5d6.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And then 5d6 obviously has got a big range. I mean, you could be down in, 5, you could be as high as 30. You're more likely to be around sort of between the 50
Yeah.
and 20 mark. So that's where the difficulties would be set. Um, And they did have there, I think, like one of the dice again would be a different color,
Hmm.
and they would go like, 1 on that means it's like bad force, and 6 on that is good. So again, we're seeing that thing, but because we're rolling multiple dice, we can always have something else happening
Yeah.
because we can take one dice and treat that dice differently.
Yeah, you could
Um,
trigger some kind of additional variable, whatever it is, by having that extra die. Yeah, that's a good
so
point.
again, that was different because your stat was now a dice. You
Hmm.
weren't rolling, you could be rolling different stuff. So if you go like, I mean, it's just me being petty, but if I'm playing a system where I'm always rolling 2d6, I'm like, it just seems a bit naff. This is, this is like playing Monopoly. I'm rolling 2d6. I can do that in a board game. So at least Star Wars gets round that because you're rolling
Yeah,
a different number of d6 every time, and that's cool. And it was quick and easy. You look at your character sheet, that's what you roll. People aren't going, what do I roll? You roll what it says
right.
on your character sheet. There's no rolling something and add it. You roll what it says on the character sheet. So it was straightforward with that. But if you start hitting sort of 5, 6, 7s on your dice, um, it doesn't take
And
ages to
and
count
weapon
it. Not quick.
damages, everything was D6. So
Yeah.
weapon damages were rated in numbers of dice, and you'd roll, and then you would roll the total number. You would compare that against a stat on the target, and that would determine just like how much damage they took. It wasn't points. You wouldn't like, oh, I rolled 13, and therefore you take 13 points of damage. It was actually like a tiered damage system. But the one drawback to that is that some people don't do mental math very quickly.
No.
And when you roll those multiple dice, you are more likely to have them go bouncing across or off the table. And some people like to, your Shadowrun players, they want to have this deluge of dice.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we will. And the Year Zero engine, the original version of it, also does create a deluge of dice under many circumstances. But
Well,
when
yeah,
you're adding them together, that here's an advantage to like say 3d6 or 2d6. You're never going to go above that number,
yeah.
and for most people, it's pretty easy to add those together.
And that is the problem with that.
Yeah,
So again, you've got a bell curve. It's awkward to work out the bell curve because the thing is you've got different people rolling different dice. That does make
correct.
calculating your difficulties harder, but it does give you a good option for having a dice that does something special. So again, pros and cons.
It does. I mean,
Um,
you could say though that a character who has 3d6 in something is generally going to their typical results,
yeah,
their center of mass typical results will be higher than someone with 2d6 and
yeah,
lower than someone with 46 plus 1. So you could there was a degree of consistency, but you're
yeah.
right. When you're rolling all these different dice, it's yeah,
Well, the other place you have a problem is if something that's difficult is difficulty 15, you can't hit that on 2d6.
no,
Just never. And you don't see that in many games. So for me, it was when I played it back in the 90s, it felt cool, and it was a massive step away from D&D
sure.
and rolling one dice. So it
It was
felt,
the first. I mean, in '87 when Wegg's Star Wars came out, that was the first dice pool. Well, something like rather
yeah,
pool of dice. How's that? It's still not a dice
yes,
pool system,
because
but
it's still
pool of
additive.
dice system. It was something different, and it
Yeah,
was fresh. I'm going to throw one other system out there before I think we're going to move on to actual proper dice pools,
I might
and
have
that's
one more then.
oh, you
Actually, I
have
might
one
have
more.
two more.
Okay. Well, I'll just throw Gumshoe out there because Gumshoe is you roll a single die six and you add usually a very small modifier, like +1 or +2. And usually, if you don't add any I know if you don't add any modifiers, it is a 50%. So 4, 5, and 6 is success. Now the
Oh.
GM can adjust that. I tell you, it's
On
super simple.
1d6.
It's a single die six, which
Oh,
really makes you want to buy like a big one. You want to have
it
one
makes
that's
you
like
want
the
to
size of it's freaking huge, like the size of
flip
someone's
the
head,
coin.
because there's
Oh.
just this one kind of pathetic little die with pips dotted on it. Now
Yeah, you want a big one. Foam
the
one, which you can throw at someone.
the mission of Gumshoe is not to have lots of
Yeah,
die
yeah,
rolling and not, I mean but that's another one that's like that. You're rolling
yeah.
a single die, you're trying to meet or beat a number, and you're able to put in fixed modifiers to goose the die roll. That's it.
See, that's funny because that Gumshoe is an example of relatively modern game design, and that's
Well,
where they
because
wrote
of
it.
what it does with the
Yeah,
investigative abilities.
yeah. Because I was talking about the West End Games one. Before we get on to where this will head. I always throw out some other old ones. Percentage-based system. It's really bog standard. You probably have a stat. Usually your stats are a percentile number, and you roll a D100. And again, now the funny thing with that is actually that's very close to. It's not a million miles away from a D20. Yes, you've got 100 different ranges, but in reality, if your stats 83, then you've got exactly 83% chance of passing. And then what a plus 10% modifier or a minus 20% modifier does. So it's a super easy system. The one cool thing there is, again, because you do have 2 dice, you then do it. So, doubles can mean something different.
Yeah.
They can be a different color. So you do have a little bit more range because you are playing with 2 dice, but those 2 dice are actually just giving you a result between 1 and 100. Apart from the annoying, you still do have the really annoying thing that roll in 0, 0 is 100, not 0. But
the interesting thing about a percentile based system is that I've seen some that fall for the modifier trap, where the designers try to get really granular because you have this very wide range to play with. Like, well, we can have plus and minus 5%, 10%, 15%, 3%. You can piles of modifiers. Something I'll throw out there. The first percentile based system I ever experienced was Star Frontiers. And Star Frontiers is, straight percentage. And then what they did, it was actually the first game I ever played that had skills.
For some reason, one of the problems with percentile-based systems is that they then decide to make character creation incredibly common. Like, let's have millions of skills, and each one of those skills is going to have a different rating. Like, you only really care if they're up in 5s, but no, we're going to take, we're going to have the base stat, and the base stat, you're then going to add on this thing. This was the first edition.
I think the trouble with it is that because on the one hand, like say Gumshoe, you reduce the possible dice results to 6. And then with modifiers, you only have 6 options. You only have 6, potential die rolling outcomes. You have 100, and there just seems like there's all these ways to plug in more stuff. I will throw this out there. You mentioned doubles and how just the act of rolling more than 1 die opens doors. You mentioned doubles. Chill 3rd edition, which had some really interesting innovations and some weirdness in it too, and it is no longer supported, but whatever. What they did was when you rolled, it was, roll under percentage. Okay, so let's say you have a 80% chance of something, and you roll the 80, and if you succeeded and rolled doubles, that was considered, or rather, if you succeeded and rolled under half, that was a high success. If you just succeeded, that was just a success. If you rolled under half your number, that was a high success. Now, obviously, that gives the higher numbers not only a greater chance to succeed, but the more skilled people a greater chance to succeed really well. It also doubled down on rolling doubles, that if you succeeded and rolled doubles, that was the highest level of success, which as you think of it, but it made it easy, because if you had an 80% and you rolled a 77, actually with an 80%, you would have there'd be 7 opportunities.
Yeah.
Rolling 11 through 77 to roll this top tier success that I don't remember what it's called. And if you failed and rolled doubles, that was a botch.
Yeah. I think that's why I think percentage is really clever. The fact is that having the 2 dice and a very clear thing with what you're doing for. You can look at your character sheet, see what you're aiming for. Yep. And then it's very, very easy. And actually modifiers aren't difficult, because when you just go, right, we're going to add or subtract 10. Again, straightforward. As long as modifiers are 10s. Start going into 5s and just stay with 10s.
And I think
the whole rolling a double is great. You can't do that on a D20. Nope. You can do it on a percentage thing. It's pretty random. But again, the whole thing you just said was absolutely spot on. The higher your skill is, there are more doubles you can roll.
Yep.
And there are less botches you can roll. So it actually works both ways. It's actually quite clever. Do you know the other thing you can do, though, with a percentage? You could roll percentile dice and then look it up on a colored chart.
You could. Like with Marvel Superheroes.
Or
Chill 1st edition, which used a colored chart.
And I'm not going to go much more into that, but so there are systems to do that. Or the really weird one, and you mentioned it the other day, and I can't remember if it was during a podcast or afterwards, the ones, and you said you hated this, which is why I'm bringing it up, just to rub it in. You roll a dice, that dice then you refer to a table. That table then gives you another set of values, which you then take that set of values and you add it to something else, and
Time
then you
Lords.
compare that. I mean, Torg does that, and it's the worst bit of Torg. And
Yeah,
there's a reason why they do it, but it's a bad reason. They
yeah,
didn't need to do it. They
no,
could get rid of it. Phase whip's fine. You roll your percentage dice, you look at your stat, you cross-reference at a table. It does take a little bit of
yeah,
time, but then you get degrees of success because you get these, green, yellow, and
yeah.
red, and other ones have added in blue results.
It's
So it's
interesting.
cool.
TSR tried in the mid to late 80s. They actually tried to move a number of systems to things like that. Like Gamma World Third Edition has it was actually the last edition from TSR has a color coded table, like a big color coded table. Marvel Superheroes, the original and the advanced, and then the revised table like that. Even Star Frontiers in its kind of its dying days, when they put out Zebulon's Guide to the Galaxy, they replaced the core mechanic, or they revised the core mechanic with a color coded table. So it seemed like TSR was trying to innovate on that, double down on percentages and tables through those games. But yeah, that stuff's rare nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I still phase rip isn't the idea of a color coded table isn't bad because yes, it's something you have to check. But if all you're doing is looking at your stats, rolling some dice,
Yep.
cross reference to a table, that's not much worse than
No,
what a
it's
lot
not.
of other things do. I still think it's quicker than like adding 6 dice together, and
Yeah.
it's quicker than adding. I've got rolled 20 dice and I need to count for
Yeah.
something. So it
Yeah. And
isn't the longest mechanic. The minute
chill
you have to
first.
do a modifier and add it back, that's terrible.
Yeah,
Don't do
that's
that.
awful. Chill First Edition had a table that there was a combat table. There were I think three different tables if I remember
Uh,
correct. No. But here's what it was. It was the exact same mechanic. It was just situational. Like
okay.
one of them was combat, and then within it was hand to hand. Like if you were doing hand to hand combat, there was a more limited range for how much damage you could do. If you were dealing with like magic or fear or something like it was they were the exact same table, but they were adjusted so that the results were appropriate for different situations. And the nice thing was that the tables then, when you cross-referenced, you got degree of success or failure.
Yeah.
And that was really handy. That was like,
Yeah.
I think that was the first game that I saw that in, like, oh, it's not just binary. That's cool.
No, I mean that's the cool thing, like the universal table in phase. That's what it's doing cool. The different color codes gives you degrees of success, and
Yep.
much easier to get. The degree of success on that is the easiest way you can do it, short of what we'll get into,
Yep.
because you've rolled your dice, you've checked your stat, you get a color. Green is good, yellow is bad, red is crazy good. I mean that actually seems weird, like it should be the other way around, but whatever. But that's that having degree of success, and it lets you do cool things. And actually, they did really clever things with that. And in fact, the whole thing, like the back of the thing, because I'm looking at a bigger version of the table where for every different kind of action or whatever you do, those it means something, and it's all just written on the table. So actually, you had your character as a player, you would have your character and that sheet, and that's all you needed. You didn't need a ton of modifiers
Yeah.
because everything was on the sheet. All the cool stuff you could do is on the sheet. So it's not, it's old school, but it had there's benefits to it.
Yeah. It's interesting because you're making me think here. Like I am, as I kick around the idea of coming up with a system, and I'm not entirely sure why I want to do. I'm just curious, And there's a lot of stuff out there. It's really easy to just take something like D20 or turn it into like D12. But it's the same thing really. You roll one die, you add some fixed modifiers, you try to, and then you compare it to a number. And it could be low, it could be high, but it's the same thing. Um, you could do the same thing by using multiple dice, but you're just adding them together. You could represent stats and skills as a number of dice.
I
Um,
forgot that one.
what's up?
I forgot that.
A specific system?
Yeah, but two, but yeah.
You could do all those things, but all of these, even with a percentile, although it seems to me right now as we're talking through, my gears are turning far more for percentile than any of
Mm.
the other two because you have more options with those two dice and what they end up the numbers that they generate. You mean so interesting. Like I'm actually revisiting my idea for what I might do system
Yeah,
wise.
for everything we've looked at so far, percentile is the one that I'm thinking, yeah, actually, I forgot. I really like your skill is 80 and you roll 77 and 77 does something cool because it's a double
Yep.
and you succeeded.
Yep. And if you
But if
wanted to
you
be
roll
more
88, it's
granular,
the
and
other way.
if you wanted to be more granular, and I think there'd be a quick tipping point where, in my opinion, it would get silly. But like you could say, well, if you roll under half, you get something, out of this. If you roll the doubles and you succeed, then you get even more. You could cut that down to like if you roll under half, or you roll under 1/4, or you roll, what you could if you wanted to try to thin slice degrees of success by virtue of having a wider range of numbers, you have more territory to operate in to do that. Interesting. Because it's weird, actually, and this is entirely irrational. It's totally subjective and irrational. Like, to me, for years, I used to like percentile systems, and then something just like clicked, and I look at them as kind of dusty and stodgy. But now you're making
It's
me think about them again.
it's silly because they're at the end of the day, I mean, in our next category of stuff, I'll get into some examples of where people are just trying to be silly. But I think some of these they just feel old.
Yeah,
It's stupid, but I think one of the reasons we like the system we do is it feels a bit more modern and
yeah.
different.
But here's the thing though. It's not actually, as long as the way that you are rolling and what you're doing with the results isn't cumbersome and stupid,
Yeah,
it's really
shouldn't matter.
not the die. It's what they
I know.
enable you to do. And again, and I always harp on this. Like, how does that help to model the feel
Yeah, yeah,
or the type of action you say you want in your game, or is it just a resolution mechanic?
yeah. I mean, it's just like it's a silly thing. It's the other. Oh, the new shiny. That's old. This dull. Been there, seen that. I like new shiny. New shiny's always better. It's
You
just silly.
admit that, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
What
do
I do.
too.
All right, let's go on to the
No, we
main thing.
can't.
So, what do you mean we can't?
I told you we were going to go for 40 minutes and we're 3 minutes shy of that. But this is beautiful, actually, because what we've done now is we have covered the most basic.
Yeah, we
What's the
have.
name? What do we want to call this? I've seen it referred to as like a linear progression. I don't know
Uh,
mathematically if that is or isn't.
well, no, because we talked about bell curve things.
Oh, that's true. But I mean,
So,
the idea of I'm rolling the dice to generate a single number, and I'm comparing that to another
well,
single number.
it's most of what we've done so far is very much it's a dice
Yeah,
roll plus something
plus
versus
or
a
minus
target
something.
number, or with the exception or of like we've talked about percentage based
Yeah,
things as well. But these are what I would call sort of standard. These are do you know what I would call all of these?
do it.
Basic,
Basic. Okay.
because that's what it is. It's
Okay.
you're rolling one dice, or you're rolling 2d6 or 3d6, which is I've done that in board games,
Yep.
or you're rolling a percentage. Now, it's not saying it's bad. If you want to
No.
term basic as bad,
No.
I mean, I am saying that, but
Well, I'm not.
but you're not
Well,
saying that,
well,
and it just depends what mood you're in. I like saying there are times when these mechanics are going to be absolutely spot on for what you want to do
yeah.
because you want to do something straight and quick, and this is going to work.
Yeah. Well,
And there are times you want to do
yeah.
fancier stuff and it'll be sillier. Some of the ones we'll look at next time will be silly and pointless. I know some silly and pointless things that use dice pools, but these are non-dice pools. And
These are
so
I like this basic. You are
this
by
is,
some means you are generating one number. You are
yeah,
comparing it against another number. Whether or not that determines binary success or failure or degrees of is dependent upon the actual nature of the mechanic, but that's what it's doing. That is a basic dice mechanic. I
I think
like it.
today's winner for me would be percentage, which is funny
I
because I
agree.
think of that as being, oh, this is a bit naff, but
I
actually you can do clever things with it.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes through discussion you end up not convincing yourself of something else, but you recognize something that you hadn't, just rattling around in your own head. I
Yep.
find that fascinating.
All right. To be continued.
All
And while you're
right.
waiting for us to be continued,
Oh yeah, that's
like,
right.
subscribe,
Like, subscribe,
leave a comment,
leave a comment,
join the Discord.
join the Discord, join the conversation. Buy Eris. Buy
Yeah.
Eris.
Join our non-existent Patreon and give us money for something we were going to do for free, but we're asking you to pay for it. That you don't
That's
have
right.
to.
That's right.
We won't.
Actually, you know what? We'll
We're not doing
provide
that.
a PO box, and you can just send us unmarked, unsequential bills in a greasy paper sack. I would prefer that. None of this Bitcoin crap. Nothing traceable through PayPal. I want dirty 20 and $5 and $10 bills and stuff in a paper
I
sack
want to
under a
meet
park
in
bench.
I want to meet in the basement, like part of a parking lot, and I want it in I want it in a briefcase.
Who
And
doesn't?
you have to be wearing a trench coat
Well,
and a
yeah.
fedora, or it doesn't count.
Wait, no. And when you come up to me with the brushed aluminum briefcase, you put it down on something, turn it around, open it up, and very dramatically go whoop and open up the front to show the top of it to show me all the bills.
It's like $10 in it.
It's like comes up, it's rattling. There's like a handful of change. It's Chuck E. Cheese tokens. You're like, Chuck E. Cheese isn't even open anymore, you son of a bitch. Hey, dear listeners, we want more than frickin' prize tokens at the Chuck E. Cheese prize counter. I don't want another like finger puppet topper.
We
I need
are
better than that.
perfectly happy with likes and sharing this with
We are.
other people. Get
That's
the
right.
word out. Share our message. Join our cult. Oh no, we're not meant to say that. I
No,
forgot.
it's our cabal.
Oh, that sounds better now.
Well, there's never like a group of sorcerers. It's a cabal of sorcerers, isn't it?
I don't.
A cabal of podcasting gamer types.
Right now, we've just gone off one now completely. You just lost the plot.
Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.